You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 362 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Have you ever had the feeling when you visit a museum and you say to yourself, wow, that exhibit was great? I had that experience last year when I visited the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Now, the National Museum of the American Indian has an exhibit called Nation to Nation, Treaties between the United States and American Indian Nations. And as I walked through the exhibit, I was able to see treaties the United States has made with American Indian nations, learn more about those treaties and the outcome of them. I found the exhibit so fascinating that I wanted to find a way to share it with you. David W. Penny is the Associate Director of Museum Scholarship, Exhibitions, and Public Engagement at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. He's also an internationally recognized scholar and curator who has a lot of expertise in Native American art history. He was also involved in creating the Nation to Nation exhibit. Now, during our exhibit tour, David reveals the story behind the National Museum of the American Indian and its creation, information about the treaty-making process and how Indigenous nations and the United States approach that process, and details about some of the important treaties the United States has created with Indigenous nations and whether or not the terms of those treaties have been fulfilled. But first, in case you missed it, my colleagues at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios produced a multimedia event as part of our annual July 4th commemoration and celebration. We released a blog post, short video, and podcast episode to help you consider the founding of the United States and how we have and how we will commemorate it as we move closer to 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. To watch our video, read our blog post, and hear our special episode, visit benfranklinsworld.com/361. We have all the links to all the media posted there. So just visit benfranklinsworld.com/361. Okay, are you ready to tour the Nation to Nation exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian? Allow me to introduce you to our expert guide. Joining us is the Associate Director of Museum Scholarship, Exhibitions, and Public Engagement at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. He's an internationally recognized scholar, curator, and administrator with research and curatorial expertise in Native American art history. He has overseen the creation of dozens of museum exhibits, many during his long career at the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and now during his work for the Smithsonian. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, David W. Penny.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
David, I'm curious about your job title. You're the Associate Director of the Museum's Scholarship, Exhibitions, and Public Engagement. So it sounds like you wear a lot of different professional hats. And I wonder if you would tell us more about the work you do for the Smithsonian.
Sure. I joined the Smithsonian in 2011 after 30 years at the Detroit Institute of Arts. When I was recruited by NMAI, National Museum of the American Indian, first I was asked to lead the curatorial departments. And so that included basically two large sections of curatorial. One deals with collections history, the other more broadly with history and culture, and also includes our repatriation department, which is very active. In Detroit, I had considerable experience with exhibition development. I was a project manager for a big reinstallation project. So I've run exhibition departments and publications departments in the past. And as our previous head of exhibitions retired, I was asked to fill that role as well. So I'm supervising the exhibitions department, publications, our media department, and web, which we call collectively public engagement.
Would you talk to us a bit more about your curatorial work? We know curators are the people who create museum exhibits, but I've also heard them described as the historians of stuff. So would you tell us more about the work you've done as a curator throughout your long career?
Well, I am an art historian, so really my first focus in my career was stuff or physical artworks. And art history is the discipline of the history of art. The other area of curatorial work involved in collections really comes out of more of museum anthropology model, where anthropologists have collected artifacts as representations of culture for more than a century or so. And certainly the National Museum of the American Indian has its roots in a ethnographically collected collection. So their objects represent culture in some ways or another. We deal with material culture very broadly, which includes even things like what we eat, how we grow our food, all kinds of ways in which human beings interact with the physical world, their environment through things as extensions of themselves. So that's part of our research as well. But mostly in terms of the context of the museum work, what we're doing is, I'll characterize it broadly as content development. We have ideas, certainly at the National Museum of the American Indian, ideas that we'd like to get across to a broad range of visitors about American Indians, about American history. And of course, our experience shows that much of what's been taught in schools in the past, many of the assumptions about American Indian history and American Indian identity are false or misleading. So our education mission is also not only providing new information, but correcting erroneous information that many, through no fault of their own, many Americans, many citizens of the world think about in terms of American Indians.
One of the remarkable aspects of the National Museum of the American Indian is it is the first national museum in the United States dedicated exclusively to Native Americans and indigenous peoples in North America. David, I wonder if you would tell us about the history behind this museum's creation and why the United States Congress and the Smithsonian thought we really need a national museum for the discussion of Native American history. Would you talk to us about that?
Well, it's an interesting story. It is not necessarily the first museum that was devoted to American Indian topics. I think of the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles, or other museums that have taken American Indians as their focus, let's say the Heard Museum in Phoenix. The difference here was the National Museum of the American Indian was intended to be run and largely staffed by American Indians. And principally the notion of run, in the sense that the American museums have been involved with American Indians since their inception, since the early 19th century. But not always for purposes that we would approve of today. Most Americans of the 19th century, maybe early 20th century, never thought that American Indians, American Indian culture, American Indian tribes would persist into the future. Actually, policy was designed around absorbing American Indians into the polity of the United States, and eventually American Indian tribes would become extinct. Therefore, museums would take this role of representing America's past through representations of that past through artifacts. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, museums, American museums, engaged in these vast collecting enterprises. The origins of the National Museum of the American Indian really lie in the old Museum of the American Indian, which was created by basically a mining engineer turned industrialist, George Gustav High. And he created his Museum of the American Indian in New York in 1916. It was a fairly traditional museum devoted to American Indian culture, but mainly with that salvage paradigm that we're going to go out and collect because American Indian culture is about to disappear. And little did they imagine it, or perhaps they did, that by collecting and by taking material culture, treasured possessions, belongings out of community and placing in the museums, they're actually facilitating the further erasure of American Indian culture in the United States. That all began to turn around, I think, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. The National Museum of the American Indian is certainly a product of that rethinking of the way that museums will represent American Indians in the present and in the future. So the idea was, well, we need a museum that will speak with Native voices, that will promote Native perspectives on themselves for the purposes of enlightening others. And this was perceived as necessary because a lot of policy, a lot of issues that really affected Indian country today were based upon these old ideas, stereotypes, and erroneous assumptions about who American Indians were, who they are today, and so on. So the founders of the museum saw great value in having a museum as part of the Smithsonian that could help correct that story. Another big issue that was being addressed at the time of the founding of the museum and was created by an act of Congress in 1989. And that was the Smithsonian in particular, and many other museums, included in their collections lots of human remains. And these human remains of American Indians had been collected under sometimes very nefarious circumstances. So it was a point of great sensitivity and outrage actually that the Smithsonian and other museums were curating these collections, which Native communities felt had been improperly dug up from their grave sites, stored in museums, and should be reburied with respect instead of being kept in the museum storage rooms. So in addition to creating the museum in 1989, the NMAI Act, as it's called, created the first repatriation legislation in the United States. So a pathway for source communities to reclaim objects of cultural sensitivity, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and particularly human remains, so they could be properly reburied in the ground. The 1989 Act was followed very quickly by the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which is a national act that affects all museums that accept federal money. So the National Museum of the American Indian is really the beginning of this process of reconsidering collections all across the country and deciding what was inappropriately collected and returning those things to their source communities.
It sounds like the National Museum of the American Indian is really the beginning of this much larger process of reconsidering museum collections all across the country and deciding what objects and artifacts were inappropriately collected. And it seems that returning those objects and artifacts that were inappropriately collected to their original communities is really a very large part of the museum's work to repatriate those items to indigenous nations.
We have an active repatriation program and are processing a long queue of claims. Our first emphasis was focusing on human remains and objects associated with human remains and burials, and working on claims having to do with cultural patrimony. Those are objects that were never owned by any individual, but were owned collectively, and therefore could never have been alienated by any individual through sale, so we never really had rights of possession to them to begin with. And then there are what were termed in the law sacred objects, and these are objects that are necessary for the ongoing practice of religion, which is also protected by other legislation like the Freedom of Religion Act. So they just sort of reinforces the notion that if you're deprived of your material culture, you can't practice your culture. So those repatriation acts, the NMAI Act and NAGPRA, are intended to and address those issues.
Hearing that the museum first came about in 1989 is really helpful because I think many of us were wondering about the museum's name. We've had a lot of guests on this podcast, David, and many of them are Indigenous people, and they've been very careful with the terminology that they use to refer to Native Americans. So I think we'd like to know about the name of the museum and why it's called the National Museum of the American Indian and not, say, the National Museum of Indigenous History or the National Museum of Native American History.
It's an interesting question, although I have to say, in all my 40 years of speaking on this topic among various groups and individuals, that the number one question, the most frequently asked question is it Native American? Is it American Indian? What's the proper term or expression? And to me, that signals this uncomfortableness and unease the country still has about speaking about this topic. How are we to refer to them? I can understand the sort of sensitivity around it. Certainly, when we think the term American Indian as an idea, it's not a thing. And the idea is an artificial construction. How do we characterize all the indigenous residents of the United States, of North America, of this hemisphere? So we've created a number of collective terms to try to capture that enormity, in a sense, that kind of artificial construct. We have maybe Europeans or Africans or otherwise. But American Indian is certainly a term that's, despite its problems, has been around for a long time, and it is fairly clear. Native Americans, I often use that in conversation as a term of respect. Indigenous seems to be on the sort of ascent in the sense of a proper term, but I think scholars have begun to raise issues about how could it be applied, for example, in Asia or in Africa, who is indigenous and who is not. The notion of indigenous really sort of stems from some kind of colonial experience where there is an overlay of a settler colonial nation state on top, in the sense, of indigenous peoples. So the historical construct is kind of implied in the notion of indigenous, people of the land, people of that place. Aboriginal, Canada was sort of flirting with that term for a while, but become sort of awkward, although it's still in use in Australia. So I guess I would just ask for a certain amount of forbearance and respect in terms of trying to find proper and respectful terms to capture these big, broad questions. And there's no question that we're continuing to discuss them. It's possible, I suppose, that the Museum of the American Indian might change its name sometime in the future. But for the present, we are what we are.
If you've had the chance to visit the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., then you know it features fantastic and poignant exhibits. Exhibits including Nation to Nation, Treaties Behind the United States and American Indian Nations. David, I was really taken with this exhibit when I had the chance to visit your museum, and I wonder if you would tell us about the Nation to Nation exhibit and what led the Smithsonian to create it.
Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations. It's an exhibition, I think, that the museum had been thinking about for years before I arrived. And I arrived, remember, in 2011. I think the idea originated with the well-known late scholar Vine Deloria, who was one of the great intellectual leaders of the American Indian movement and Native rights, generally speaking. And he was very much involved with the founding of the museum. And his colleague, Suzanne Schoen Harjo, who was the guest curator of the exhibition, but as the guest curator, the intellectual force behind the idea. And so Vine Deloria, I know he passed, he walked on in 2005. The idea predates his demise. So a good 10 years before I arrived, they were thinking about how do we deal with this treaty history in an exhibition format. I came to the museum with, as I think I mentioned earlier, some experience and expertise in exhibition development. And the director of that time, Kevin Gover, was a former assistant secretary for the Department of Indian Affairs, also an esteemed attorney in Indian law. He took a great deal of interest in this topic as well. And that was the first really big job they handed me, is figure out some way of getting this exhibition organized, work with Suzanne Harjo, and let's see if we can develop an exhibition. So I was responsible really for the staff efforts, developing the content that Suzanne had authored, and creating a formally immersive learning environment where our visitors can learn about treaties and their histories.
Now, before we continue with our behind-the-scenes tour of the Nation to Nation exhibit, it's really important for us to take a moment to understand what treaties are, and specifically to understand what treaties between indigenous nations and the United States accomplish. So, David, would you help us better understand treaties like those in the Nation to Nation exhibit, and specifically treaties between indigenous nations and the United States? When we talk about treaties in school, we don't typically talk about treaties between indigenous nations and the United States.
It's true. And we found actually in our advanced testing that there is a lot of misunderstanding about treaties. A treaty is a provisional reconciliation of two very different objectives and points of view. So there is a conflict, and you either can fight about it, or when you decide to stop fighting about it, you come to some agreement about stopping to fight about it, or how you're going to manage your differences. And basically, a treaty is a documentation of managing those differences. So as we developed the content for the exhibition, we looked at individual treaties that represented certain kind of ideas or moments in history. But we structured the discussion in a kind of a parallel way for each one of the treaties we discussed. First, we looked at what were the issues at stake and where were they? Who were the participants who were negotiating on both sides and what were their objectives? And how did the treaty itself resolve those differences, or what resolutions did it make? And then we have a brief view of the aftermath, what happened afterwards. The larger issue with treaties in the context of American Indian law and also American Indian history is that, and this is a unique situation in the history of colonialism across the world, the United States forged a rather unique, sometimes very problematic, but totally unique relationship with its indigenous peoples through treaties. And they kind of backed into it after the Revolutionary War, when the United States made the decision that American Indians were not going to be citizens. They're not going to be part of the polity. So what are they going to be? How are we going to think about them, and how are we going to deal with them? So the model was, and it was a fairly fresh model in even European history, the notion of a treaty between sovereign states, some kind of agreement which would allow us to work together. So basically, the analogy was that American Indian tribes were like foreign nations. The United States would manage their relationships with them through treaties. So a treaty is a recognition of the inherent sovereignty of those tribes. Maybe your listeners are familiar with the notion of federally recognized tribes throughout the United States. There are over 570 of them. But this idea of sovereignty, inherent sovereignty, as reinforced, not always necessarily, but sometimes reinforced through these treaty negotiations, which acknowledged that common sovereignty, that nation-to-nation relationship. That's why we call the exhibition Nation to Nation. And those treaties, they have not been abrogated. They're still alive today and are the basis, really, of much of modern American Indian law. Looks back to treaties, the original agreements, how they've been modified or otherwise adjusted or eliminated over time. But treaties are really the leverage in which, in many cases, to seek sovereign rights today. And that's an important distinction, I think, for your visitors. We think about minority rights in the United States. We're thinking about equal rights. Often it's the way it's framed. It's a very different situation with American Indians where we're talking about the rights of sovereignty, an inherent sovereignty, the right for self-determination. And this has always been and continues to be an issue of negotiation. We don't have many nations living inside the United States. That's been made really clear in American law, but there is some kind of sovereignty that continues to be negotiated. So in our hierarchy of governments, we have different kinds of polities. You have towns and villages, you have counties, you have states. A federally recognized Indian tribe on a reservation is somewhere in that mix as a polity that has certain sovereign rights. And as I say, those are continually being negotiated. But they're enshrined in treaties. And today are the sort of modern treaties, the way Suzanne Harjo thinks about them, are the kind of legislation and consent decrees and other kinds of ways in which the federal government manages relationships with states, counties, and other governmental entities throughout the United States.
If we look back in history, the young United States created treaties pretty early on in its existence. If we think about the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the French, right? That was created in 1777 and 1778. And then, of course, we have the Treaty of Paris that ended the War for Independence in 1783. David, did the young United States use those early experiences with treaty creation with Europe as a way to develop the format or the specific processes of treaty making with indigenous nations, or did they just kind of make this process up as they went along?
The model stemmed primarily from treaties made with the crown. And I probably know more about that in terms of the British colonies than I do about the French colonies. Treaties, even with a crown, they run a sort of a mix about what they address. Some of the early treaties, for example, treaties in Virginia, established reservations where tobacco planters could not plant. It was like a 10-mile circle around a particular village that European planters were prohibited to settle. Or treaties might be alliances, British treaties with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy against the French, for example, and their alliances and mutual conflict against the French to the north. American treaties, by and large, are about acquiring land from native polities. And the model there comes from earlier British models, particularly after 1763, when Britain realized it had to impose some order on this free-for-all of land purchasing that was taking place in colonies in North America. So colonists were acquiring land, buying land from native proprietors, but who they bought the land from wasn't always so clear, or whether they had the authority to sell wasn't so clear. There were often conflicting claims amongst individuals. So in 1763, the British Crown established that the only buyer for Indian land would be the Crown itself. So you couldn't buy land independently. The British government would negotiate for land, and then the British government would sell that land to individuals. The United States picked up that model, and treaties by and large, in the sense, and I think it's the Northwest Ordinance that codifies this, where the United States government is the only entity that can buy land from American Indians. American Indians cannot sell land to anyone else except for the United States government. That's called a preemption right. And then the United States government would then sell land to the states or to land speculators or others for their own purposes.
Now, when you visit the National Museum of the American Indians Nation to Nation exhibit, you'll find that the United States has entered into approximately 374 treaties with indigenous peoples. And the Nation to Nation exhibit highlights 16 of those treaties, which were negotiated between 1776 and 1868. David, why did the National Museum of the American Indians curatorial team select the 16 treaties that it did for this exhibit instead of some of the other treaties in this large collection of 374 treaties?
We feature in the exhibition fewer than 16 treaties. The 16 treaty number you're citing is actually the treaties that we've borrowed from the National Archives to feature in the exhibition at different times, and I'll get back to that. Early on, I think with Suzanne Harjo's research, she identified dozens and dozens of treaties that she wanted to investigate. We had to find a way of kind of organizing those into a narrative, a way of telling the story of treaty history, and also reducing them. So it was early conversations I think we had with Suzanne Harjo, director Kevin Gover, me, and Philip Deloria, who is Vine Deloria's son, who is now faculty at Harvard University. I think he was at the University of Michigan at the time. But we crafted a narrative arc, the way that the exhibition is organized, beginning with an introduction about treaty making broadly speaking, but then looking at 3 historic episodes of treaty making. First is what we're calling serious diplomacy. And these are early treaties in American history that resemble most international treaties in the sense that they deal with issues of the location of borders, the recognition of laws, regulation of trade, those kinds of issues, and alliances, military alliances. And so we selected treaties, the Treaty with Muskogee in New York of 1790, the Canandaigua Treaty of 1794, and the Horse Creek Treaty of 1851, where these were treaties that really dealt with those basic issues of how we're going to regulate relations between ourselves, nation to nation. The second large section, Suzanne Harjo called Bad Acts, Bad Paper. These are largely treaties of the removal era, when the United States made the decision, policy-wise, to basically impose ethnic cleansing on the United States east of the Mississippi. So they negotiated, often through coercion, treaties with the eastern tribes for their removal from eastern United States. And this was done through treaties. And so the federal commissioners would go out, organize these sessions. Often the situation was dire enough, coercive enough, so that people felt forced to sign. So their treaties of the removal area really were to clear the east of native populations so that they could be settled by white Americans, immigrants. That was the principal reason for those treaties. Later on, the third section we call We Never Gave Up. And that really begins with the notion that these inequitable treaty relationships were never satisfactory to Native participants. And there is a continual parade of delegations going to Washington to point out the problems, the issues, to negotiate solutions to them, which culminates with various changes in policy from the Indian Reorganization Act in the 30s, where they're recognizing tribal governments, to termination laws in the 1950s, where to get rid of all the tribes. But by 1960s, 1970s, there is general consensus to restore, based upon treaty history, the limited sovereignty that the tribes enjoy, and the series of legislative acts that Suzanne Harjo calls the modern treaties that recognize sovereign rights of the Indian tribes.
I think we need to mention that of these 374 treaties that the United States has created with indigenous nations, Congress has ratified some of those treaties, but it hasn't ratified all of them. David, I'm thinking about California Treaty K, which is one of these treaties that has gone unratified by Congress. Would you tell us about that treaty and about the differences between a ratified treaty and an unratified treaty?
The United States created a rather complicated process in terms of legislation for treaties. In the law, the Senate and the president pursue treaties and negotiate them, but it's Congress, the House, that has to pay for them. So by the late 1860s, I think it's when federal government begins to sort of reorganize itself, reorganize these rules, so they're not making commitments to tribes and treaties for payments and annuities that Congress then doesn't want to pay for. So there is this process in which the treaties are negotiated and have to be ratified and make sure that the terms of the treaty can be fulfilled by the United States government through payment and other provisions there. And there are many treaties actually that go through a process of having further amendments, changes that have to then go back for renegotiation. So it's a process of going back and forth. Now, the California treaties that you reference are a rather unique case in American history, and it results really from the rather unique and really awful circumstances of American Indians in California around the time of the gold rush. That after 1849, this tremendous influx of settlers into that area when they felt that American Indians were largely in the way. Estimation of population of American Indians in California about 100,000 or so. Because of this huge growth in population of the state very quickly, California becomes a state, applies for statehood in 1850. And immediately, federal government is pressured by the state to negotiate treaties with the tribes to open up land for settlement. So they send out 3 commissioners who know very little about the terrain or the native peoples involved. And I think it's fair to say that the ethnic situation in terms of how many different tribes, how many different languages is exceptionally high in California. Great cultural complexity there. So they divided up California into three big sections. They traveled around and talked to a number of people. Even today, we can't figure out exactly who they talked to. The signatures are simply X's where they had touched the pen, but there's really no true negotiation. The terms of negotiation were reversed as well. Instead of actually acquiring land, they were claiming all the land and negotiating 18 large reservations where native people could reside in California. So when that went back to the Senate in, I think it's 1852, the California contingent, their legislatures, their government officials, opposed it. They thought that the reservations were too large and included too much desirable land. So they refused to ratify it, or they blocked ratification, and actually put it into a classification of secrecy until 1905. So nobody knew actually what was in the treaty. In the meantime, California sort of embarked upon what can be fairly characterized as the most egregious genocide in American history, to the extent that individual communities were raising money to hire militia groups to basically go out and kill Indians, to put it bluntly. And this took place all during the 1850s. Population diminishes tremendously by over 50%, 75% in very few years. The United States government creates a number of military reservations, basically just to create areas of refuge for native tribes. The California legislature has a number of different laws they put into place, which includes, in terms of administrating so-called vagrant Indians or landless Indians, that it makes it legal to basically enslave them as laborers if they don't have any visible means of support, particularly native children. And to raise money for these militia groups, they sold bonds. Some of those bonds continue to be paid out to their possessors well into the 20th century. So it's a really difficult and in many ways shameful history. I think we include it in our exhibition to demonstrate that, well, you may think a treaty is bad enough, but no treaty is far worse. And so without any formal federal protections, the situation for California Indians was disastrously awful.
We know from our conversations with many historians that culture determines a lot in our lives. It can determine how we dress, how we talk, the food we eat, and it can even determine how we understand things, like treaties. David, we need to take a moment for our episode sponsor, after which, would you tell us how the Nation to Nation exhibit reflects cultural understandings or perhaps misunderstandings? History tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are as people, nations, and communities. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation believes that for each generation to address the challenges it faces and to bring about a better world in which to live, each generation must learn from history, which is why its mission is that the future may learn from the past. This is why the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation runs the world's largest museum dedicated to helping you investigate the history and origins of the United States. And as the world's largest United States history museum, Colonial Williamsburg always has a lot of research, activities, and programming all year round. To stay up to date with what Colonial Williamsburg and its scholars are discovering about the past, and to explore its wide range of activities and programming, be sure you sign up for one of its email lists. You can do so by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. At benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe, you can opt in to learn more about Colonial Williamsburg's seasonal and special events, its art museums, its teacher institute, and about other areas of its work. Again, to keep up to date with Colonial Williamsburg and its range of research and programs, sign up for its email lists. benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. David, how does the Nation to Nation exhibit address cultural understandings and perhaps misunderstandings between the United States and the indigenous people that the nation has negotiated treaties with?
Suzanne, our guest curator, wanted very much for our general visitors to understand that treaties really were the foundation of inherent sovereignty as recognized by U.S. law, which is a situation that the tribes never asked for, but nevertheless, that kind of security of having a nation-to-nation agreement reinforces that notion of inherent sovereignty. It's a difficult issue, I think, for general public to grasp, often because I think we've been brought up to understand that treaties are bad, A lot of the advanced research that we did was people were telling us that, yeah, treaties were bad and all treaties were broken. Certainly, the United States failed to live up to its treaty obligation, no question about it. But no treaties were abrogated in the sense of they went back and said these treaties no longer exist. And the treaties, as I mentioned earlier, really are this kind of foundation for that nation-to-nation relationship that persists today. So we use a kind of a metaphor that, from a native perspective, that comes from Oren Lyons, the Seneca faith keeper. Who's also very instrumental in the founding of the museum, worked very closely with Suzanne Schoen-Harjo and this exhibition. He evokes the notion of what we call the gaswenta, or the two-row wampum belt. Now, wampum is a shell bead made from a particular clamshell on the northeast coast called a quahog. When you make a bunch of beads, there are two different colors, either white or there's a really beautiful deep purple that comes from the inside of a quahog. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, among other nations, Haudenosaunee are also known as the Iroquois, they wove belts of wampum that they used in ways to further and reinforce diplomacy. So if I was going to make a speech and outline the articles of a treaty, I would illustrate that with a wampum belt. And the wampum belt, a belt woven of these shell beads, would become the kind of material expression of that agreement. The gaswenta, which is the name of a particular wampum belt, is associated with the first treaties between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Dutch colonists in the Hudson Valley. The design is basically a white shell belt with two long purple stripes in parallel down the length of the belt. And the story, as Oren Lyon tells us, is that really this is a story of a metaphor for the way in which the colonists and the Haudenosaunee natives are going to manage their relations, that each one of those purple strips represents, on one hand, the European ship, on the other hand, the native canoe, and they will proceed together through time in parallel, not interfering with one another, but in respect of one another and with the white wampum beads in between as symbols of peace and goodwill. So that is the principle of treaty making, agreement making from, say, a native perspective. In the United States, or at least Anglo-American law, we often think of treaties as a kind of transaction. In other words, you fulfill your side of the bargain, I fulfill my side of the bargain, we're done. Nothing more to talk about. From the point of view of the gaswenta, or the point of view of native treaties, native diplomacy, the treaty is just the beginning of a relationship, so that over time you continue to refresh that relationship with further discussion, further interaction. The metaphor of polishing the covenant chain, the chain that connects the two of us, is another Haudenosaunee metaphor. So I think those two different ideas about what a treaty is and how to manage relations between different parties are reflected in the way that the United States acted and behaved on one hand and the native nations on the other. Native nations were seeing treaties as a part of an ongoing relationship that needed to continually be burnished, protected, cared for, revisited consistently. Whereas the United States was looking for the bargain. We want this land, we'll give you this much money, and give you this reservation, that's where you live, that's the end of it. But actually, I think in terms of what we're seeing today and persistence of treaties, the native perspective is won out. Treaties continue to be an issue that are debated, discussed, polished, but are at the heart of this ongoing nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and native nations.
Speaking of the Haudenosaunee, in episode 264, we spoke with historian Michael Oberg about one of the treaties featured in the Nation-to-Nation exhibit, and that's the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua. David, since we can go back to that episode and hear Michael talk about the Treaty of Canandaigua in a lot of detail, would you tell us about one or two of the other treaties that we can see and learn about in the Nation-to-Nation exhibit?
Sure. I'm particularly partial to the so-called Horse Creek Treaty, or Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. And we include this in the section I mentioned earlier about serious diplomacy. Of course, 1851 is not an early treaty, but it's the first treaty out on the Great American Plains. Fort Laramie is down in southern Wyoming. It's located right on the immigration route from St. Louis to the west. There it branches at Fort Laramie either north up to the Oregon territories or south into California. So it's a key spot. But of course, in the 1840s, the immigration along what was called the Platte Road, that major immigration route across the plains, was just a trickle, 100 people in 1845. That all changes with the 1849 gold rush, where all of a sudden you've got, in 1850, 25,000 people crossing the plains. And of course, the tribes that are resident there are many. There's the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Arikara, Hidatsa, Mandan, and others. These are their territories. They're dependent upon buffalo and the grass that the buffalo eat, on the timber for fires and so on. And of course, this mass immigration is just eating up those resources, scattering game, and people are getting into conflicts. So the federal government decides to organize a massive treaty in 1851, where they invite the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, Assiniboine, Hidatsa, Mandan, Arikara, Crow. The Shoshone aren't invited, but they show up anyway. The Southern Plains tribes do not show up. They've been fighting with the Northern Plains tribes and unsure about their security, so they choose not to come. But there may have been as many as 10,000 people assembled there in September for these treaty negotiations. Basically, what the United States wants to do is to establish tribal territories. Which land, which territory belongs to which one of those tribes. And also to establish who is the principal spokesperson, who is the chief or the point person that's going to deal with the federal government and their ongoing relations. Why do they want to do this? They want to know, first of all, if there are problems, if there are attacks or otherwise incidents with immigrants and Indians, they want to know who's responsible. So what territory that takes place in, and who will talk to them. Knowing this takes place in 1851, I'm sure the treaty negotiators are also anticipating the future when there'll be in negotiations about acquiring that land. And what they need to establish is, who does that land belong to? So by dividing it up to the different tribes, they're essentially reducing the number of claims for any particular piece of property. We want this, we talk to this tribe, we want that area, we talk to that tribe. And they're also identifying what are the protocols in terms of who we're going to speak with, who are going to be the treaty signers in the future. So it's a kind of preliminary step in what will become the appropriation of the plains and dispossession of the tribes there in years to come.
Yvonne notes that it really seems to her like the United States government has this long history of not honoring and not holding up its end of the treaties that it negotiated and agreed to with all of these different Native American nations that we've been talking about. And she wonders if any of the 374 treaties that the United States has negotiated with indigenous peoples have ever been fulfilled and actually upheld by the United States.
I think this question sort of gets back to this popular perception that treaties were all broken and that treaties are all bad. As I mentioned earlier, none of the treaties have been formally abrogated. They are still active. And it means that every citizen in the United States is implicated in those treaties, holding up our end of the bargain, and Native nations are as well. Those treaties continue to be revisited, renegotiated, endangered. There are instances like the termination efforts in the 1950s to completely eliminate any kind of independent relationship between the United States and tribes. And many tribes were terminated. Tribes of California, the Menominee, and others. Some have been able to reseek and regain their federal recognition. So it's not so much, I think, an issue of treaties being broken. It's really about the degree in which the United States government holds up its end of the bargain in good faith. And that has continued to be a problem as the tribes look to the United States for what was promised in the treaties. And what was promised in the treaties was this transactional bargain. You'll give up your land, you'll move, and in return, we'll give you a reservation, or you'll be free to have a reservation. You'll have certain rights, you'll be paid certain annuities, they're often educational. In some of the treaties, there are provisions for the tribes to be able to continue to hunt and fish and collect on their traditional territories. This has been an ongoing issue and continues to be an issue today because, of course, hunting licenses, regulation of fisheries, state forests, these are all under state administration, not federal administration. And the tribes are saying, well, wait a minute, we signed a federal treaty, our deal's with the feds. The states are saying, we don't care because these are now under state administration. So you have to follow state law. That's resulted in suits in the 1960s where the tribes joined together with the federal government to sue the states to recognize their treaty rights over fishing, hunting, and gathering. I spent 30 years in Michigan. It was only in the 1980s that the tribes of Michigan and the state government were able to craft what we called an inland consent decree, which allowed traditional artists to go into state lands to collect materials for basketry and other kinds of arts and crafts. So these are issues that continue to be negotiated and debated today. Some might say, and I think it's fair, that federal government holds a preponderance of the cards, the big Goliath to the tribes, David, but the tribes amazingly resilient and perseverant in their pursuit of their treaty rights and also this notion of some kind of self-determination through recognition of sovereignty.
So as we've heard, the Nation to Nation exhibit goes a long way to helping us develop better understandings of the United States' history of treaty making with Indigenous peoples. And David, I wonder if you would tell us why you think it's important that we build these better understandings of treaties between the United States government and Indigenous nations.
From my perspective, it really has to do with this unique situation of American Indians in the United States, often referred to casually as federal recognition. It's unique in the world. It doesn't exist in Canada, it doesn't exist in other nations that have indigenous populations, South America, and so on. I think most Americans deeply misunderstand what that's all about. And often American Indian issues, sovereignty issues, are conflated with race issues. Certainly, American Indians have been victims of racism, no question about it. But when we sort of conflate all these difficulties into issues of minority rights or equal rights, we're sort of missing the sovereign rights issue. That these nations, in what's now the United States, were independent, fully successful, operating sovereignties at the time of the arrival of colonists on their shores in the 17th century, and they never gave up that sovereignty. And actually, federal law has enshrined that sovereignty. But this is, I think, a story that most Americans remain largely oblivious about. So I think the treaty story is sort of at the basis and the foundation of understanding this particular relationship between this, we'll call it a minority in the United States, but with a particular and special status, because the fact is that all land in the United States is native land. As Suzanne Harjo likes to say, European colonists didn't drag land behind them when they crossed the Atlantic. So the United States is built on native land. And the treaties essentially are the evidence of that bargain, often a coercive bargain, but a bargain nevertheless, that for that land, we're going to be repaid or paid or recognized in certain ways. And that's a story, as I say, that is largely missing from most people's consciousness.
We should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. David, you've just informed us how complicated treaties can be, and that they may look unfulfilled and they may look broken, but sometimes that's just not the case. So in your opinion, what might have happened if the United States government had fully fulfilled just one of the treaties featured in the Nation to Nation exhibit? How might the trajectories of the native nation or nations and the United States have turned out differently?
I thought we'd talk about the first treaty negotiated by the United States with an Indian nation was the Delaware Treaty of 1778. This is a treaty basically negotiated by Continental Congress. There was no constitution yet. They're in the middle of the Revolutionary War, in fact, at a fairly fraught moment. In 1778, Washington had just fought a number of actions outside of Philadelphia, and we're kind of at a stalemate. France was about to enter the war, but the United States was trying to shore up its western border. Now, most of the tribes in the Revolution sided with the British because they already had existing relationships with the Crown, treaties and otherwise. One of the contributing causes of their revolution was the 1763 proclamation line that forbade settlement west of the Alleghenies. That was an issue that rebels took issue with. In fact, it's called out in the Declaration of Independence that among the grievances that the Crown won't protect us from merciless savages. Well, the merciless savages that were defending their homes west of the Alleghenies when they're invaded by Virginians, like Daniel Boone and others. So the United States realized it had trouble on its western border. And so they entered into a relationship and negotiations with the Delaware. A faction of the Delaware in particular was more friendly with the Americans, with the rebels. And their leader was a fellow we know today as White Eyes, who negotiated the first treaty. And they would side with the United States in the revolution. They would help the United States with their campaign in the West to help take Detroit. And thanks for that, White Eyes was encouraged to organize the 14th state of the Union as a native state. Now imagine that. What happened, unfortunately, was that White Eyes began to lead that expedition to Detroit. He was assassinated by an American soldier. So the Delaware were quickly disabused of any notion of American help. They ended up siding with the British, and the rest we could talk about. But let's just imagine for a moment that the United States was sort of open to this notion of there being a 14th state with Indians. Now, sort of extend that. What are the requirements for creating a state? You need a certain population. Then you need to petition. Actually, it's not that difficult. You need to get approval from Congress. But what if the other tribes across North America began to raise their hands and say, well, we want a state too? Now, a state is not the same as a sovereign nation. They can't control their citizenship as much, but it's fun to imagine what would have happened if the United States was open to thinking about American Indians as citizens of this new experiment, this new democracy in North America, and were open to the idea of natives participating in federal government on a state level. And we might have a whole checkerboard of states across North America today that have their origins in native states. The Cherokee, for example, in the early 20th century, petitioned to create a state in Oklahoma before Oklahoma achieved statehood. Feds rejected it. Puerto Rico is still waiting for statehood. I live in D.C. We're waiting for statehood as well. It's just fun to imagine, I think, this idea of alternative histories if native sovereignty in the United States had been recognized in a more genuine way. As the treaty negotiations for the War of 1812 posited the creation of a Anishinaabe state as a buffer state between the United States and Canada. What if that had happened? What if the ideas of creating a Cherokee Republic, what if that had stuck? What if we had, instead of this monolithic United States in North America, we had a series of settler states and indigenous states that were living and cooperating together? It's just fascinating to imagine the possibilities.
It is really fascinating. And right now, I'm imagining, what if the United States had 624 states, which would be comprised, of course, of the 574 federally recognized tribes and the 50 states we already have?
Yeah, but the language of the Treaty of 1778 invites the Delaware to organize the tribes together. So you might have ended up having sort of blocks of tribes that collaborated. And as I say, there are many ways in which this fantasy can kind of get stuck on the rocks of reality. But it's just interesting to think about all these sort of missed opportunities that are alternative to this idea of manifest destiny, that once the United States was created, the east coast of the continent, that it was their destiny to create a nation state that would extend to the Pacific Ocean.
So how can we come and visit the National Museum of the American Indian and see this nation-to-nation exhibit for ourselves? Do you have any tips or tricks you can share with us, David, and help us get the most out of our visit?
Information about our hours and what's being offered are on our website. But also we have a lot of content, including more materials about the Treaties exhibition and other exhibitions that we're featuring in our building. I'd also like to remind your visitors that not only do we have a public facility in the mall down in Washington, D.C., but also a museum in New York City, down in Battery Park, right at the tip of Manhattan. There, we've just opened a fabulous permanent exhibition called Native New York, which looks at the tribes of New York State in a broad historical and cultural way. Most of the time, you'll find, in addition to our permanent exhibits, Nation to Nation, and the mall, and the other large exhibit we have currently is an exhibition called Americans. That's an exhibition that looks at the way that the United States has branded itself with images of American Indians. Curators Paul Chet Smith and Cecile Gantome, where travel United States Indians, in a sense, are everywhere. You've got street names, car models, locations that have these Indian names, but native people, the tribes themselves, are largely invisible. So we're looking at the ways in which American popular culture has appropriated American Indian branding, not just simply as stereotypes, often they are, but think of sports teams, but also icons of quality or fierceness and ferocity. There's a convention with the U.S. military that all their helicopters have to have Indian tribal names because it extols this notion of military prowess. So there are many different ways in which American Indians are a part in the fabric of our lives as American citizens, but we still remain largely ignorant of authentic American Indian history, authentic American Indian lives, and so on. So that's a really interesting project to look at as well. And we usually have an exhibition that features contemporary Native art. So in June, in our mall facility, we'll be opening a wonderful exhibition by a prominent Anishinaabe or Ojibwa painter from Canada, Robert Houle, who is one of the most celebrated Indigenous painters in Canada, very little known in the United States, his first big exhibition here. So we're very excited about that.
Now, if we can't travel to the museums in New York City or Washington, D.C., are there any virtual options that would still allow us to experience the National Museum of the American Indian?
Yes, through our website, we have online exhibitions, wonderful exhibition online right now called Developing Stories, which is a series we've asked Indigenous photojournalists to create stories about their communities. So that's featured online with long interviews with the journalists about their work. Another online exhibition, Ancestors Know Who We Are, features artists of both African American and Indigenous identity. Wonderful show. We also, for teachers and just, I think, the general public who are curious, an extensive catalog of curriculum units we call Native Knowledge 360 or NK 360, which deals with treaty issues, California issues. These are all designed for use in the classroom, and they include multimedia, texts, images, a variety of different kinds of learning experiences, but they're really entertaining and informative for the general public as well. So I encourage you to take a look at those.
And what if we have more questions about Indigenous history or the National Museum of the American Indian? Is there a way we can contact you?
Yes. Through the website, there are portals for visitor queries, and we staff those portals consistently. So I'm constantly getting questions from our general public about this and that come through our website. So please feel free to poke around our website. If you got specific questions, there are ways of getting those to the right people. That would be the best way.
David Penny, thank you for joining us and for taking us through the history of the United States' treaty-making process with Indigenous nations, and for introducing us to the National Museum of the American Indian.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
There's a popular perception that every treaty the United States has made with Indigenous peoples contains a bad deal that has been broken. And as we just heard from David, that isn't true. None of the hundreds of treaties the United States has negotiated with Indigenous nations has ever been abrogated or repealed. Technically, all of the treaties are still in effect, and many of them are still looked at by each party, and some have even been added to and renegotiated. With that said, as David mentioned, the United States did negotiate many of these treaties against a backdrop that many scholars have described as coercive. American settlers settled Indigenous lands as the nation pushed west, and U.S. military personnel were sent into these areas of new settlement to help protect the settlers. But the bigger story that David has asked us to consider is the nature of the United States' relationships with Indigenous nations. And this is something that we can see through the different treaties in the nation-to-nation exhibit. As David related, the United States has a unique relationship with the Indigenous nations that live within its borders. This unique relationship developed because the founders of the nation decided very early on that American Indians would not be considered citizens of the United States, but rather members of sovereign nations. Now, if you read the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the founders spelled out, quote, that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, end quote. One of the powers which independent states may of right do is treat with foreign nations and negotiate treaties, alliances, and trade agreements with them. And this brings us to the nature of the United States' relationship with the 574 federally recognized tribal nations that live within its borders. As American Indians were denied United States citizenship until Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, the only way for the federal government to interact with Native Americans was as members of foreign nations. And dealing with a foreign nation requires formal delegations, talks, negotiations, and treaties or agreements. Now, as David pointed out, it's also interesting and important for us to note how the United States and Indigenous nations understood and understand their formal diplomatic relations and agreements with each other. Indigenous nations consider treaties and diplomatic relations as the start of an ongoing relationship. They view treaties as places where disagreements were ended or resolved and where new relationships are created. Conversely, the United States tends to view treaties as transactions. Rather than creating a new relationship, the United States views treaties as a one-time transaction designed to end grievances. And once those grievances have ended, the United States moves on to other issues in other areas of its foreign diplomacy. Understanding these different viewpoints really helps us gain a better understanding of how and why the United States has the relationships it has with different indigenous nations. It also helps us better understand how and why indigenous nations also still have sovereignty within the larger polity of the United States, and why United States law still upholds that sovereignty. Look for more information about the National Museum of the American Indian and its nation-to-nation exhibit, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/362. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Joseph Edelman, Holly White, Ian Tonat, and Taylor Fisher. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other museums and exhibits would you like to explore? We can try and do that here on the podcast, so let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.